Welcome, everybody. So first of all, to start off, I'd actually like to introduce the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Dr. Fatih Birol, to say a few remarks.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, when we look at the numbers, it is obvious to see that much has changed since we have the last year 2023 breakthrough agenda report. One of them is we had a COP28 consensus outcomes as far as the energy sector is concerned. There are many important items, such as tripling the global renewable capacity, doubling the energy efficiency, and both of them are based on the IEA analysis. But having the targets is something, to implement them is something else, because when we again look at the numbers, as we do at the IEA, we see that the renewable capacity between now and 2030 may increase about 2.8 times, close to 3 times, but this is the capacity. Capacity is not equal to generation. In order to enable this, we need to build grids, power grids. We need to make sure that the battery storage is developed. And as far as the energy efficiency doubling is concerned, electrification plays a very important role. So how are we going to implement those targets? How are we going to accelerate the clean energy transition, renewables, energy efficiency, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and others? There are, of course, many challenges in front of them, and if I have to pick up one, it is the challenge of having efficient and fair international collaboration. Our report this year, the Breakthrough Agenda report, focuses on different initiatives around the world, among the countries, how we can bring them together, identify the right sectors, and improve the international collaboration. We had a detailed look at the different difficult sectors to abate, and many countries and many initiatives, and made some suggestions, advices to governments in order to accelerate the clean energy transition by enhancing the international collaboration. We very much hope that this new report will help to improve international collaboration on energy and climate, which is badly needed. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So, dear friends and partners in the global clean energy transition, I'm Frances Way, Executive Director of the Climate Champions team. And on behalf of the high-level climate champions, the IEA and CGIAR, I thank you all for joining us this morning for the virtual launch of the Breakthrough Agenda Report 2024 and being part of this exciting journey. We're launching 2 reports today, one that's written by the IEA and the Climate Champions that you will find on the IEA.org website, and the other, an agriculture standalone report written by CGIAR that you will find on a link that is agriculture-breakthrough2024.cgiar.org. So as you are all aware, the Breakthrough Agenda was launched at COP26 in 2021 as a way to enhance targeted international collaboration in the global economy's largest emitting sectors, which today cover more than 60% of global GHG emissions. The annual process of the Breakthrough Agenda aims to align actions by countries to make clean technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible, and attractive options globally. The process is now supported by 59 countries, representing over 80% of global GDP, and by over 150 initiatives. Over the last 3 years, the IEA, in collaboration with the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions, have published a report to track progress on international collaboration for mitigating GHG emissions across several sectors. Last year, the IEA and the high-level champions provided recommendations on how to enhance international collaboration, which signatory countries responded to at COP28 in the form of 28 agreed priority actions, which were all specific, timely, and measurable. This year, the 2024 report assesses the state of the transition and the progress in international collaboration in 6 key sectors covered by the Breakthrough Agenda: power, hydrogen, road transport, steel, cement, and buildings, and recommends targeted actions for accelerating global cooperation to deliver transitions that are faster, easier, and cheaper for all. A separate report led by CGIAR and also presented here today looks at progress in the agriculture sector, and this year the specific focus on the subsectors of fertilizers and livestock. The third edition of the report shows that while deployment of clean energy technologies is growing at a rapid pace, it is concentrated in some regions. Progress is uneven across sectors, and global emissions continue to rise. Breakthrough goals in the building sector and cement and concrete sectors were launched in the current cycle, reflecting growing international cooperation in these sectors. The takeaway message of the report is clear. International collaboration between national governments, civil society, business, and local actors is vital to deliver on the world's ambitious climate pledges. We now need more determined collective efforts to agree on standards and certifications, create demand for clean technologies, provide targeted financial and technical assistance, and to align international trade for catalyzing the equitable transition. On behalf of the IEA, the high-level champions, and CGIAR, I would like to thank all authors, contributors, and reviewers of the report. A special mention to the UK government for funding this report and for leading the Breakthrough Agenda process, which has created an ecosystem for successful international collaboration. I will now pass it over to Mr. Timur Gul, the Chief Energy Technology Officer and Head of the Energy Technology and Policy Division at the IEA, and Mr. Simon Sharp, Director of Economics at the Climate Champions team, to present the findings of this year's report. And then following their presentation, Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Director of CGIAR Climate Impact Platform, will present the key findings of the Breakthrough Agenda Agriculture Report, which will be launched at the inaugural Baku Climate Action Week. Over to Timur.
Thank you very much, Francis, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, also from my end. My name is Timur Gül, as Francis already said. I'm Chief Energy Technology Officer here at the IEA and Head of the Energy Technology Policy team of the International Energy Agency. It is my great pleasure to present the findings of the 2024 Breakthrough Agenda report here alongside Simon Sharp from the Climate Champions team, and I would really like to emphasize just how incredibly useful the collaboration has been between us and the Climate Champions team in order to come up with this particular assessment of what's going on in terms of international collaboration in a couple of key sectors. Now, the Breakthrough Agenda, as hopefully everyone is aware, was launched at COP26 in 2021 as a way to enhance targeted international collaboration in the global economy's largest emitting sectors. What it covers today in terms of sectors is more than 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This particular report, it has been said before, is in fact the third edition. It reviews progress that has been made on international collaboration in those sectors of the Breakthrough Agenda that are related to the production and use of energy, namely the power, the road transport, hydrogen, steel, cement, and building sectors. And the colleagues from CGIAR will come up with their separate report on the agricultural sector in addition. Our report here identifies the most significant and urgent areas where international collaboration could be strengthened and recommends steps to be taken in this regard. These are intended to be converted into priority actions at COP29 in just a couple of weeks from now. In some sectors, such as power and road transport, we are seeing an unprecedented uptick in clean energy technology deployment and investment thanks to government policies and falling costs. Take electric cars as an example, very prominent, of course. but I think a very good illustration of what's going on in specific sectors. Just 4 years ago, only 1 in every 25 cars sold worldwide was electric. This year, we at the IEA expecting more than 1 in every 5 cars to be sold worldwide to be electric. In China, actually, EV sales exceeded even 50% of all car sales in recent months, not because of climate policies, not because of sales targets, but because EVs are getting cheaper and cheaper. More than 60% of all EVs sold in China last year were cheaper at the point of purchase than their conventional internal combustion engine vehicle counterparts. But to reach global net zero emissions by mid-century, many more such success stories are needed across many sectors. And we fundamentally believe that individual country action alone will not be sufficient for achieving that. We see this in the geographic disparities where clean energy technologies are being deployed and financed, which is typically concentrated in advanced economies and in China. It will require international collaboration across a range of areas within this decade to enhance the individual actions by countries and business and help put all sectors and those of the breakthrough agenda together must contribute to around 3/4 of cumulative energy-related CO2 emission reductions by 2050 in the IEA's net zero emission by 2050 scenario on a 1.5 degree pathway. Where is well-targeted international collaboration most pressing? It is to mobilize finance and technical assistance to emerging markets and developing economies, where a 5-fold increase in clean energy spending is required by 2030. Move net zero compatible technologies to market through sharing research and innovation learnings. Create new markets for low emission materials and fuels that are competitive with incumbent fossil-based options. And overcome obstacles to widespread clean energy deployment, including enabling infrastructure and trade. As I said earlier, we've assessed progress in international collaboration. Our executive director also mentioned that earlier in the sectors of the breakthrough agenda, and we did so against the breakthrough goals. I think this is very important because for the assessment, it is vital to recognize that the breakthrough goals themselves are highly ambitious. In many ways, just as the goal of limiting the global mean temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees is extremely challenging to be met. The breakthrough goals aim to make clean energy technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible, and attractive options in key sectors and in all key regions by 2030, a level of ambition that is truly unprecedented. For countries to collaborate, it always takes a concerted and sustained effort to find areas of common ground across varying political and institutional contexts in the right formats, in the right moments. For countries to do so effectively in a way and a timeline that aligns with a net zero trajectory takes certainly a Herculean effort. 3 years ago, when the first Breakthrough Agenda report was launched, we identified a set of areas where international collaboration is best targeted to accelerate clean energy transitions, innovation to drive down cost, deployment to reach economies of scale, demand creation to pull technologies to market, technical and financial support to reach wider adoption, standard creation and infrastructure coordination to ensure interoperability, and trade conditions to level the playing field and bring countries to the table. We've been tracking progress in these areas ever since. Our assessment was informed by dialogues with civil society, stakeholders, companies, and various different others. What we found is that the picture of collaboration across all sectors is very diverse. We see good progress seen in yellow, moderate progress seen in orange, and minimal progress in red, spread throughout and within sectors depending on the area of collaboration. The blank areas, just to clarify that you see here, mean that we did not assess that particular area of collaboration for that sectors. There are a few areas where we've been quite disappointed. They are marked by red in our assessment. Two in particular are demand creation here in steel and cement, and finance in the power sector. In both areas, we've seen some positive developments in the past year, such as new public procurement pledges by countries for low-emission steel and cement, and record levels of global investment going to clean energy. But these developments themselves are not enough. For example, for steel and cement, there is an urgent need for more governments to convert pledges into firm commitments and stronger policies in order to mobilize investment. For the power sector, global clean energy investment is largely concentrated in advanced economies in China, with limited progress to reduce the cost of capital of projects in emerging economies and to target support in fossil fuel-dependent communities to create local jobs and skills. Overall, though, in many other areas, and that's very important, there has been notable groundwork that's been laid, which gives us reason to be hopeful. Work has been going on behind the scenes, not only in the past year, which is the focus of our assessment, but for years before, building a foundation for clean energy transitions. The UAE consensus at COP21 set a remarkable goal for the power sector to triple renewable energy capacity and double energy efficiency by the end of the decade. Our executive director highlighted that earlier. In fact, earlier this week, the IEA released a report that outlines what it takes to implement these goals and how countries can work together here. It found that achieving the tripling and doubling goals is feasible, but will require additional effort to set the right enabling conditions for tripling renewable capacity. This means, for example, building and modernizing 25 million kilometers of electricity grids by 2030 and increasing energy storage, both areas of focus in the power sector recommendations of the Breakthrough Agenda report. For energy efficiency, it requires governments around the world to make this a much greater policy priority and focus relentlessly on key actions. Every region has something to contribute here. For advanced economies, this can be electrification through electric vehicles and heat pumps. For emerging economies, it may mean stronger efficiency standards, particularly for cooling equipment such as air conditioners, and for countries without full access to modern forms of energy, achieving the Sustainable Development Goal of universal access to clean cooking supplies is key to significantly reducing energy demand. We've seen good progress in the hydrogen sector as countries worked together to move forward. Discussions to establish globally harmonized standards for renewable and low-carbon hydrogen and its derivatives. Nearly 40 governments signed a declaration of intent for mutual recognition of certification schemes at COP28. In road transport, pilot projects to create digital passports for the traceability and sustainability of battery supply chains are making progress. International discussions on standardizing charging equipment are also taking place across major vehicle markets. In the steel and cement sectors, which I singled out earlier, with some areas of disappointment, but also very important to recognize that standards for low and near zero emission products are advancing as international industry and government initiatives are identifying areas of common ground on definitions and measurement methodologies. In the building sector, finally, the launch of the global cooling pledge at COP28 saw 63 countries commit to work together to increase the global average efficiency of new air conditioners by 50% by 2030 and establish minimum energy performance standards and model building energy codes, amongst others. But this is a foundation. Building this foundation is just this first step, but it gives the potential to move the needle 2-3 years further down the road. I will now pass on the word to Simon Sharp, who will go into some of the areas in more detail.
Thank you, Timur, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. This is a detailed report. It covers several sectors, as Timur said. I'm not going to talk through all of them. I'm just going to give you a flavor. I'll talk about 3 sectors, and in each of these sectors, I want to just give you a couple of examples of areas where there has been notable progress in international collaboration and areas where there's a real priority to do more. So first, looking at the power sector, as Timur already mentioned, this is the sector that's furthest forward in the transition, and there's a really rapid rate of change. Last year, the capacity of solar PV and wind, the capacity additions grew by 85% and 60% respectively compared to the previous year. The price for solar PV modules declined by almost 50% year on year, and the costs of storage are also falling rapidly and investment increasing. So there's a rapid pace of change, but still many problems to solve along the way. Where do we see significant progress? Well, one, of course, that commitment at the last COP to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. That's a very significant indicator of consensus on the pace of transition. Another area where there's significant progress that I'd highlight would be in research, development, and demonstration. Within the Mission Innovation Initiative, in which about 20 or more countries are collaborating, the Green Powered Future mission is a great example of the way that countries should be working together. Looking across pilot projects, over 80 pilot projects aligned with emissions objectives across many countries, and creating a regularly updated online resource to promote the sharing of best practice, outcomes of demonstration projects, and translatable results. And the same initiative is also moving ahead with its plan to have 5 demonstration pilots in 5 continents, each of those looking at a very high share of variable renewables in a power system, and launching those demonstration projects before the end of this year. So those are high points, but within the power sector, where do we particularly need better, more effective, scaled up collaboration? Well, one important priority is reducing the cost of capital for renewable power investments in emerging economies. We know that's a really significant barrier, and we know there are things that can be done about it. There can be low interest loans, grants at early stages of project development investment, de-risking mechanisms, and something that's particularly being looked at more now, cross-border risk guarantees, which have recently been shown to have the potential to mobilize somewhere between 6 and 25 times more finance than traditional loans, and could have a really large impact in emerging economies, given their less favorable financial conditions. Another area I'd highlight where there's really a need to do more is in relation to the just transition and the difficult transition away from coal in areas where there's the greatest dependence on it for jobs and for tax revenues, and really trying to mainstream these support to jobs and skills and economic diversification through the financial development assistance that is given to countries. That's a really important thing that needs to be done to handle the socioeconomic side of the transition alongside the technical side. There's much more that could be done there. I'll move on to hydrogen. Have the next slide, please. This, by contrast, is an area where progress is not so fast. The total production of renewable and low carbon hydrogen deployment increased from 0.7 megatons in 2022 to just below 1 megaton in 2023. That's not very fast progress, and that's less than 1% of the existing global production of fossil fuel-based hydrogen. So there's a long way to go. And of the many announced hydrogen production plants for low carbon or renewable hydrogen, only 6% of those have reached final investment decision. Cost is still the most important barrier to the adoption of renewable and low carbon hydrogen. It's still more expensive than the fossil fuel version, and that cost gap has increased recently because of inflation and the falling fossil fuel prices. So where we see progress, as Timur mentioned, is on standards. Very significant that the International Organization for Standardization has issued a technical specification for the method of determining emissions from hydrogen production and transport, and 37 governments signed a declaration of intent for mutual recognition of certification schemes for renewable and low carbon hydrogen and its derivatives. That's very good progress. A second area where there's good progress is the financial and technical assistance. There have been several new international initiatives since COP28 to scale up support for hydrogen projects in developing countries, notably from UNIDO, which has created 2 significant new programs offering grants for pilot projects in developing countries, and also from the World Bank, the 10 gigawatt Lighthouse initiative currently being established again, to try to help developing countries take more of those clean hydrogen projects towards the FID stage before 2030. Where do we see the need for more, stronger international collaboration in hydrogen? Well, above all, demand creation. If the demand for low carbon and renewable hydrogen is not created, this transition is not going to take off. And the best opportunity for that is in the sectors where hydrogen is already used, where that fossil fuel hydrogen is already being used. So we're talking about fertilizer production, refining, and the chemicals industry. There are countries gradually moving towards policy support schemes in those sectors, but there's really a huge opportunity and need for coordination there, because many of these are internationally traded commodities where the low carbon and renewable hydrogen production method will be more expensive at first. And so if those countries can coordinate on their targets for deployment and the policies that support them, there's a greater chance of a level playing field in the international market and much faster progress. The second area where more could be done is in demonstration projects. The Mission Innovation Hydrogen Valley Platform Initiative has identified 98 hydrogen valleys, places where hydrogen is being produced and used for various different purposes. But less than a quarter of those have reached final investment decision, and none of those that have reached it are in the energy or industry sectors. So there's a great need there to diversify those demonstration projects, both geographically to make sure there are enough of them in emerging economies, and also across sectors to make sure that there's a real focus on the high value end use sectors for green hydrogen, which include maritime shipping, heavy industry, and long duration energy storage. Thirdly, I want to say a bit about road transport. Move ahead to that slide, please. As Timo said, this is another one where we can be more positive about the state of the transition, particularly if we're talking about light road transport. 1 in 5 cars sold globally was electric in 2023, which is an increase of 35% compared to the year before. The costs are falling rapidly, and it looks as if price parity between electric vehicles and fossil fuel cars is likely to be achieved by 2030 for many car models in the major markets. In China, in fact, they're already there. 60% of electric cars sold in 2023 in China were already cheaper than their conventional equivalents. What's not so far along is the heavy-duty vehicle sector, where so far the electrified share of sales was less than 5%. So where do we see good progress in international collaboration? We see it in supply chain standards, particularly. Last year, countries worked together to agree approaches to improve the sustainability and transparency of battery supply chains. One of the notable initiatives is the Global Battery Alliance, and in June this year, it launched a wave of battery passport pilots with the view to establish globally harmonized, traceable, and comparable performance metrics by 2030. And in this wave, there are 11 pilots running in parallel. They're testing and generating learning about standards related to the carbon footprint of batteries, but also human rights, child labor, forced labor, indigenous people's rights, biodiversity, and circular design. And what's encouraging about this is the world's main battery manufacturing companies are involved. They together account for over 80% of global EV battery markets. So there's really good potential for that to lead to a shift and an improvement in that sector. Priorities for collaboration in road transport to go further, well, particularly need to look at heavy road transport where progress is not so fast. One area is in infrastructure development. There's a promising initiative called the 10 Green Corridors Initiative, where some governments and international organizations are working to establish 10 zero-emission freight corridor pilots by 2026 on road corridors where there's a high traffic volume across different countries. And that's really important to create the infrastructure that allows zero emission trucks to operate effectively on international routes. That's something that really could be scaled up with support from more governments. A second area is on the pace of the transition. There is a global memorandum of understanding that's working towards governments and industry stakeholders committing to all heavy-duty vehicles being zero emission by 2040. That now has support from 36 countries, as well as a large number of private sector stakeholders. But there's still a need to increase. That collective commitment currently only covers about 20% of the global market, and that hasn't increased very much in the last year. So there's a need there for more governments to align in that way. They can push the transition faster. That will generate larger economies of scale, faster cost reduction, which would be helpful for all countries. And finally, of course, as in the power sector, there is still a need for greater financial assistance and support so that this transition spreads from the core countries that are leading it now to a wider selection of countries. And as with the power sector, some of that can help in bringing down the cost of capital for new infrastructure investments. So that's a selection of areas. As you see from all of these three sectors, there is some important and substantial cooperation happening that is making the transition faster and less difficult, but there is a great deal more that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So let us now move to, let me introduce Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, who's Director of Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation of the Impact Action Platform for CGIAR. And Dr. Aditi is going to present the findings of this year's agriculture report.
Thank you, Francis, and I will keep my presentation short if I have, may I have. So this is the first year that the agriculture report was a standalone report. Last year, agriculture was a chapter in the IEA-led report. Because agriculture is also a huge sector by itself, agriculture covers everything. So we look at not only agriculture, but the agri-food system that covers everything from the pre-production phase to all the way to how farmers produce food versus how people, consumers, consume and the waste that happens along the way. So agriculture as a whole is a very, very broad sector to cover by itself. So what we did, a decision this year was to look at the agriculture, because ideally all of these, there are emissions from every bits of this. And overall agriculture sector as a whole emits up to 33% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And to be able to provide recommendations that are granular, and that's something the countries can do in terms of international collaboration. This year, we looked at two subsectors. One is the whole fertilizer sector, and we looked at both the emission reduction from the fertilizer manufacturing as well as application by the farmers on the field. And we also looked at emissions from livestock production. The other important thing I think is important to say in the context of agriculture is very context specific and is hugely different in high income countries versus low medium income countries, particularly when it comes to both fertilizers, but also in livestock, because the modes of livestock keeping are very different. Kind of stall-fed livestock versus the pasture-based livestock, the extensive livestock systems that we have in Africa. So for those of you who do not know, and I think I should have said it at the very beginning, CGIAR is the world's largest publicly funded agriculture research and innovation organization, and we work on the entire value chain of agriculture. We are a scientific organization which does research and innovation in this. So just with that bit of a background and with time, I have kept the presentation as short as possible, but the full report is available, as Francis has said, agriculture-breakthrough2024.cgir.org, and all the details are in there, and I would urge all of you to have a look. So the next slide, please. Yes, so just the agriculture breakthrough has been signed up by 19 countries so far. out of the total that have signed up for the overall breakthrough agenda. If you can go to the next slide, please. And yes, so can we go back to the last slide for a minute? Sorry. Yes. So the objective, like every breakthrough has this objective. So the agriculture breakthrough objective is to make climate resilient, sustainable agriculture the most attractive and widely adopted option for farmers everywhere by 2030. And if we go to the next slide, the four principles in which a climate resilient and sustainable agriculture is defined are that it should lead to increase in productivity and incomes, particularly for smallholder farmers. All the practices and technology should lead to mitigation, to reduction in greenhouse gas reduction, either in absolute terms or relative. Improve natural resources, that would include improved outcomes for water, land, ecosystems, and it should also lead to better resilience for the sector, particularly again for smallholder farmers and producers. So what we did was, in this report, very much like as Timur and Simon presented, one of the objectives of the breakthrough is actually to look at what has been the international collaboration in this sector. And we looked from COP26, when the breakthrough agenda was launched, all through COP27 and 28, but we also looked at some of the other initiatives of the African Union, the IFIs like the World Bank and the ADB, as well as other initiatives. The other initiative assessment is not comprehensive, while the COP ones are pretty comprehensive. So just between 2021 to 2023, over 61 initiatives and declarations have been launched at these three COPs on agri-food systems. So you can see the dark blue squares are the ones that are from COP28 initiatives. So a lot of new initiatives have come in that looks at all these aspects of the four principles of the breakthrough agenda. And the progress is, while progress has been done in terms of actual declarations, many of them have been doing a lot of work around research and development, yet the smallholder agriculture sector only receives the very small percent. Agriculture as a whole receives 4% of the climate finance, and smallholder farmers receive only 1.4%. So there is still a lot of progress to be made. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we then looked at overall, because again, the agriculture, there are so many points of entry in this report. We have looked at two specific ones, and within each of those two technologies each. So this report actually deep dives into four particular technologies. The first overall sector we have looked at is enteric methane emissions from livestock. So livestock emissions comes from two sources: emissions from the manure part of it, and enteric methane emissions from the livestock, which is from the production of from the animals itself. And within the enteric methane emissions, we have looked at two technologies, one which is much more appropriate for high-income production systems, high-income country production systems, which is around feed additives. And the other technology we have looked in the context is more appropriate for the pasture-based systems in the low-income countries, which is around promoting growing forages that have low methane emission potential. So feeding livestock with forages that can reduce emissions. So we kind of do a technical update on both of these technologies. Similarly, from the fertilizer, we look at two things. Like almost 40% of the fertilizer emissions from the fertilizer happens at the production stage of the fertilizer, and 60% happens when the farmers apply the fertilizers on their field. And we have looked at two particular technologies, one on green ammonia and another on how do we make sure that fertilizers are applied in the right amount. So those are the four sub-technologies. So I would not go into so much into it as of now, but there's a full report. If we go to the next slide, just the next two slides shows, as I said, a lot of updates around international actions that happened in the livestock sector, including the Global Methane Pledge, and a number of other initiatives that we are seeing, including some of the new initiatives around taxing methane emissions that some of the high-income countries are doing. A lot of initiatives also around research and development on understanding what kind of emissions are coming from these sectors, including some of the work that the CGIAR has been doing on measuring emissions, because such measurements are very rare in the context of low and medium income countries. Can we go to the next slide? Similar updates on the fertilizer sector along a number of initiatives by the UN and by various organizations, including the IEA, around how to reduce emissions from both the production and the use part of the fertilizer. One important is the Efficient Fertilizer Consortium that actually looks at some of these impacts, but basically a lot of action happening in this sector as well. If we can go now, I just have 2 more slides in view of all of these, and the report actually goes into the recommendations in much detail. If we go to the next slide, our recommendations focus on 5 things. So these are the high-level recommendations, but in the report, we have actual broken down what exactly can be done. So our first recommendation is around increasing climate finance directed towards these sustainable and agricultural technologies and approaches. Within that, we talk about some of the linking it with some of the science-based targets initiatives, with linking it with carbon bonds, and also about repurposing some of the inefficient subsidies that goes into agriculture. Our second body of recommendations are around encouraging of international knowledge sharing and policy. This is where there has been a lot of progress, but actually the investments in R&D is showing a declining trend. So that's again a recommendation to invest more into this sector in terms of R&D, because this sector's readiness is nowhere near, for example, what we see in the energy power sector or the road transport sector. Our third one is very much around developing common metrics and indicators. There are specific recommendations under this. A4 is around increasing support for research development and demonstration of scale of promising. And the final recommendation is around international efforts to enable private sector. So there are more specific recommendations under each one of them targeting the 2 subsectors. And I would encourage all of you to flick through the report, and happy to answer questions. Back to you, Francis.
Thank you, Aditi, and thanks to all the report writers. I know what an enormous effort goes into these reports every year for the sort of rigor and depth of information that we get that is so important. We're going to move to questions. So for all of you on the line, I invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A box. Please put your affiliation against your name as well, so we know who you are. And we're going to try and get to some of those questions. We're going to have 1 question per panelist. We've slightly moved it around a bit. And I'm going to ask all my panelists to be quite brief so that we can try and get to the Q&A if possible. So to start off, I'm going to go to Simon. Simon, the report highlights that collaboration is taking place across hundreds of countries, businesses, and initiatives in multiple sectors. How can these stakeholders that are invested in collaborative outcomes ensure that those efforts are effective?
Thanks, Francis. The one thing I want to highlight here is you need structures for international collaboration within each of the emitting sectors, institutions, forums, places where governments and other actors meet to agree what they are going to do. And this is not a small point, this is absolutely crucial. You need the appropriate structures to allow the right kind of cooperation to happen, to facilitate it. It's not enough, but it is a necessary condition. And what does an effective structure for cooperation look like? Well, it needs several characteristics. It needs the participation of the countries that account for a critical mass of the global market in that sector. It needs a focus on the problems where international cooperation can make the greatest difference in that sector. It needs intensive engagement, frequent meetings between the actual decision makers in that sector, the right people from the right parts of government in the right countries. It needs high quality input analysis, and it needs well-resourced secretariats. And when we look across the different emitting sectors, despite the wealth of initiatives and collaboration that is going on, it is actually very hard to find an institute or a forum that has all of those characteristics in any of the sectors. So strengthening those structures for collaboration in each sector should be a really high priority. Governments can do that by joining initiatives, investing in them politically and financially, commissioning research and analysis to inform the discussions, proactively tabling proposals for collaborative action. The overarching point here is you can't look at this kind of practical collaboration as some sort of side event, as an optional nice to have thing. These are the real practical problems that have to be solved for the global transition to take place at the pace required. So this has got to be absolutely central to climate change diplomacy.
Thank you, Simon. Timur, research and innovation projects can thrive in a collaborative environment, and international cooperation is essential for sharing learning with a wider set of countries. How should joint research and innovation activities be coordinated across sectors where they can provide the most value for the global community?
To answer your question, Francis, first and foremost, let me say why innovation is important. Innovation is important because we always discuss about we have all the technologies that is needed, and people wonder why are we talking about research and innovation projects. It is because we know the technologies that can help bring us to net zero emission by 2050. And many of them are in the market. They can help us bring down emissions decisively towards 2030. But if you want to go to fully to net zero emissions, decarbonize all sectors of the global economy, then you will need new technologies that are currently at demonstration at prototype stage to be brought into the market. There has been great progress on innovation. When the IEA released our first net zero roadmap 3 years ago, we said that almost half of the emission savings by 2050 need to come from technologies that were not yet in the market at the time. When we made a comprehensive update last year in September, we found that this number has shrunk to 35% in no small parts, thanks to progress that has been done in batteries. But when it comes to all these other technologies that we need in steel production, in cement production, in various different other areas, aviation, shipping, and so on, we cannot afford the innovation cycles of the past. Think about solar PV as an example. It took solar PV 30 years from the Bell slabs in the United States in the 1950s to get introduced to the market, and then another 30 years to reach just 1% of global electricity generation. This is a time that we don't have, and which is why it is so important to push innovation. Now, coming to your point on collaboration, and Simon made a lot of good points here in many ways about the broader need for collaborative outcomes and how to go about it. In innovation, it's obviously a bit more difficult to measure, to define the extent to which innovation collaboration is taking place and how it is actually effective. But there are a couple of bright spots, I believe. There are forums such as Mission Innovation where steps have been taken to advance such activities, and where I believe much more will be coming moving forward. There is the IEA Energy Innovation Forum that we hosted earlier this year for the first time ever, and for which we will follow up, where we brought together 250 people from 6 continents, startups, academia, governments, etc., to identify priority actions. We are working with our Committee on Energy Research and Technologies in a similar way. And under Brazil's 2024 G20 presidency, a new research and innovation working group was launched to raise the profile of science, technology, and innovation policy within the G20 process, and to cooperate on salient policy goals, also supported by us. So these kind of platforms will be important to advance the type of technologies in order to shorten innovation cycles and bring technologies to market. How to measure that will not always be easy, but we firmly believe that innovation, international collaboration on technology innovation and research will be vital to move the needle in terms of net zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Timur. Aditi, this year's report talks about the 2 subsectors of fertilizers and livestock and focuses on actions suitable for high income and low and middle income countries. Will these actions be enough to bend the curve in the agriculture sector? And Aditi, there are a few questions from people like Ed Davey from WRI FOLU and also from Rita Lusa, just asking how this fits in with other, where does it go from here? So if you can nod to those, that'd be great.
Yeah. I just replied to Ed, but that's exactly the point. I mean, this sector itself has so many entry points that just livestock and fertilizers, the reason we chose them for this year's deep dive is those are the two largest contributor within the ag sector, but they alone will not fix the problem or bend the curve. So I think I need to talk about two challenges in this context. One is that we also need to look at all the other points of greenhouse gas emissions. Food loss and waste is huge. I think this is the third highest. Then there are also a number of other points where that emission happens. The challenge there is that emission reduction this year, we also actually said prioritize of the 4 goals of the agriculture breakthrough. We prioritize the emission reduction one, saying that these technologies can do emission reduction without negatively affecting the other 3. But the challenge in this sector is that there aren't a lot of those technologies out there that can actually do that. So for this sector, unlike some of the other sectors which we discussed today, where investments have been going on for many decades, in this sector, many of those technologies are in a very, very infant stage or don't exist at all. So we actually need a lot more innovations and investments in innovations. The other part is also the behavioral part. A lot of the emissions actually takes place at the consumer end of the value chain. So changes in behavior is something we have to move beyond the technological changes alone to changes in behavior, such as in the context of high-income countries, changes in diets that has a huge potential, reduction in loss and waste in the context of the low-middle-income countries, just the amount of loss that happens at the level of the production itself. So various entry points. The constraint is that none of these mitigations should make food security a more of a concern. We are already not on a line to meet our SDG goals for 2030 on the food security. So there are all those challenges and trade-offs, and so we have to target both technological innovations and investments, but also overall behavioral changes, and those would be some of the important things to bend the curve. Yeah, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Aditi. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'm gonna go to Simon first, and then Timur, if you've got anything to add. I think it kind of goes to the heart of what the Breakthrough Agenda is about. So the first one that caught my eye was really about the fact that hydrogen's so expensive and how do you bring the cost down? And this is kind of, the thesis behind this process. And there is another question just mentioning from an anonymous attendee about how developing economies with fewer resources and lower ability to afford the green premium, how did they accelerate their adoption of green materials like steel and cement? But I think going specific on, we all know hydrogen's expensive. How do we make it cheaper, Simon?
Yeah, I think the best way to bring costs down is through deployment. We see that for the core technologies of the clean energy transition, they have learning curves. For solar, for wind, for batteries, and also for hydrogen electrolyzers, the more you deploy, the more the costs come down. Of course, you have fluctuations, you have differences in input costs, but over the long time scale, those relationships are quite steady. And so for green hydrogen, it benefits from the cost curve, the learning curve in electrolyzers, and also the learning curve in solar and wind for the electricity that goes into it. So if you want to get the cost to come down, you have to deploy it. To deploy it, you need some of those kind of policies that we were talking about earlier, deployment subsidies or mandates, likely to be particularly useful at first in those sectors where fossil-based hydrogen is already being used, like fertilizer production.
And Timur, would you add anything, broadening it out perhaps with steel and cement and other clean technologies? How do the developing economies, catch up with this?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Francis. And in fact, it is a very pertinent question because the IEA will release its Global Hydrogen Review next Wednesday. So I'll advertise that here. And we will, in fact, discuss some of those points in particular, because there has been a lot of activity in this year in particular. We've seen actually quite some progress on low emission hydrogen production, some other setbacks, of course, but I will not be able to discuss that too much today. Now, just to add to some of the points that Simon made. What is very important, I think, for hydrogen, and here I think we're just equating hydrogen, low emission hydrogen with electrolyzers, which is a very important route here. Mass manufacturing is vital. Now, this is what we've seen in solar PV, this is what we've seen in batteries, this is what we've seen in electric cars. Mass manufacturing and then deployment, as Simon said, is what helps bring down the cost, but there is some of that happening. For investors, it will be very important to understand the rules of the game in a way, the rules of the market, the emission thresholds that countries deem acceptable for low emission hydrogen production. Interoperability of certification schemes between different countries is a very important part. And as already mentioned, the deployment part is very important, but currently there is a real dearth of demand creation efforts. This is far and away lower than what actually would be needed to be on track with a net zero emission pathway by the year 2030. And here is where policy efforts will be needed in existing hydrogen consuming sectors, as was highlighted earlier, but also in those various new sectors. All this together will help hydrogen to bring the production cost of low emission hydrogen down, but this is not a given. It will require a lot of efforts in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Timur. We're out of time. There are a few questions just in the chat that I just want to reference about how we share information between the different sectors, and particularly between agriculture and the other areas. And I think I do just want to do a big thank you to the Breakthrough Agenda Secretariat, who actually, create such a good annual structure in terms of the roundtables and being able to share learning between the initiatives and the countries, and also the countries that lead on all these different sectors and the leading initiatives that help facilitate that. There's a lot of people involved in this annual process. This is just one part of it with the report and the recommendations. But with that, I want to thank the report writers for those reports produced today, and thank my panelists. Well, first of all, thank Dr. Fatih Birol for his remarks at the beginning, and then thank Timur Gal, Simon Sharp, and Aditi Mukherjee for all their comments and information about the report today. I do urge everybody to download the report, read them. There's some wonderful information in there. Be ready for COP29 with that information, and let's take all these actions forward. Thank you so much. Goodbye.